Hello everybody, I think we'll make a start. Welcome to this week's live stream. So just to explain, if you've not been on these before, we do these every week and it's a quick catch up with what's been going on in markets for the week so far and a look ahead to what to look out for next week. We go through all the major markets, indices, FX, some crypto, oil, gold, just have a look at where the opportunities might be. And then once we're done with all of that, I'll jump in to the questions, the chat, and have a look at any markets that you want looking at. So before we get into the markets, let's just go through the risk warning. This presentation is only for educational purposes and should not be construed as containing investment advice or an investment recommendation or an offer of or solicitation for a transaction in any financial instrument. David Jones and Capital.com accept no responsibility for any use that may be made of these comments and for any consequences of results. Spread bets and CFDs are complex instruments and come with a high risk of losing money rapidly due to leverage. 76.25% of retail investor accounts lose money when spread betting and or trading CFDs with this provider. You should consider whether you understand how spread bets and CFDs work and whether you can afford to take the high risk of losing your money. Right, important events for next week. There's a lot going on next week. 1st of November, Monday, the Bank of Japan minutes from their last meeting. Tuesday, the 2nd of November, Australian interest rate decision. Big week for interest rates next week. Thursday next week, UK interest rate decision. Clearly, interest rates very much in focus at the moment because of the whole concerns about inflation and everything else. And Friday, the 5th of November, a week today, it's the non-farm payrolls. So the US unemployment figures, normally a pretty important release, arguably a bit less important though, but a big one for financial markets. So we'll be back next Friday when we do the live stream next Friday. It will be an hour after those payrolls have come out. Okay, let's get into, before we get into it, I want to flag something up actually, a video that we put on the channel yesterday. So you're clearly watching on the channel now, the live stream. But I really would recommend you watch this video from yesterday. I did this, it's only, how long is it? It's not that long, 13 minutes long. 3 important things to know before you start trading. And I think it is completely relevant to beginner traders and experienced traders alike if trading isn't really working for you. You know, we know that most people lose money. But I think if you haven't seen that video, I would definitely recommend watching that video that we put up yesterday. Then, of course, there's that video we did last weekend all about inflation. A really highly produced video by us, so take a look at that as well and all the normal stuff in there. Right, let's get into it. The only thing I'd say, please don't spam the chat. I don't think anybody has yet, but you know, if you want me to look at an individual stock, you only need to put it in once. Don't spam the chat, or I'll have to ding you out of the chat. Okay, so just put it in once, and we'll get around to it once we've done everything else. Right, what should we start with? I think, shall we start with? Let's start with Tesla actually, even though we don't normally cover Tesla. I thought we'd start with Tesla because it's been a big week for Tesla. Through $1,000, Tesla stock. So trading at 1,077 at the moment. There was that news earlier in the week about Hertz, the rental company, placing an order for, was it 100,000 Tesla Model 3s, wasn't it? A value of $4 billion. And we've seen the Tesla valuation increase by $100 billion this week through $1 trillion. They're a $1 trillion company now, Tesla. So a great example, actually, of trading with the trends. Look at that trend. If you've watched a few of these, you know I'm a big fan of trading with the trend. Absolutely cracking performance over the last 18 months. Where does it go from here? Who knows? I mean, I think the thing is, I saw someone put in the chat, when's the right time to buy Tesla? Who knows? Do you buy it now because you think it's going to go to $2,000? Do you wait for a pullback, which is what I'd be tempted to do, but maybe the pullback never comes and you miss out on further gains? I think it's always difficult when there is an explosive move like this. For me, if it did start weakening from here, I'd be watching $1,000 because clearly it's something of a line in the sand, the $1,000 mark. You can see it there earlier in the week when it blipped through and came back to it. So I'd be watching that. Then after that, the old highs at $900 back here. So that whole $900 to $1,000 zone would be where I'd be looking for support to come in if we saw Tesla weaken. I mean, it's done great for the position in Tesla. We've been running this for ages. 18th of May, so we're 5 months into that. And the initial risk was £250, and the trade is up about 6 times that, almost 6 times that at the moment. So that's turned out to be a really good trade on Tesla and a great trend. And that was, I think, the big stock news this week. Anyway, let's get back to our more normal markets. S&P, so the broader US stock market index, fresh all-time highs again. Here we go. Bounce back from that big sell-off we saw in September into early October, and very briefly pushed out to fresh all-time highs for the S&P this week. What can you say? For me, it's buy the dips. For me, it's a buy the dip market. I think, you know, even if the line in the sand now for me is down around 4,300, the lows from October, you know, it would take weakness through there for me to start worrying about perhaps a much deeper sell-off for the S&P. But for now, you know, it looks like it's shrugged off that what ended up being quite a sizable correction from September into October, and it's off again. NASDAQ as well. NASDAQ very briefly yesterday. I did a trade on the NASDAQ this week. I got out of it yesterday, but very briefly pushed out. You can see it there. Pushed out to fresh all-time highs again, just up here, 28th of October, 15,790. The previous all-time high was 15,710, near enough, from September. So 80 points through that. Again, you know, just want to be a buyer on dips. Really, you know, a market with this sort of strength. I mean, it is pretty overbought up here. If you look at the RSI, you know, clearly it's pushed into overbought. Not surprisingly, given the fact the market's moved 1,200 points higher off the October lows. But again, stock market still, for me anyway, still very much bullish. Let's take a look at the FTSE 100. I mean, the FTSE again it sort of does its own thing, but it has managed to scrape out. It's not all-time highs, but it is the highest it's been in the recovery since the March lows. So the FTSE pushed up to 72.30. For me, you know, again, I don't trade the FTSE because it's a bit of a funny market. I'd much rather trade the S&P, but you know, that trend, I need to probably adjust that trend line now. But that trend on the FTSE is still up. So stock markets, after a bit of a shakier September, seem to be back on the old bullish footing in October. DAX is perhaps the German market. This is perhaps a little bit scrappier. The DAX, a little bit not the same sort of strength we've seen in the US. It's had a tough couple of days. The DAX. We're looking at the daily chart now. So again, if I was going to trade an index, I'd be trading the S&P. So perhaps a bit more of a mixed picture from the German market compared to US markets. We've fallen out the trend line. We've had a push up, but we haven't gone back up to the all-time high. So a bit more of a mixed picture there. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with the DAX. Not as strong, I don't think. I suppose if you wanted to go short the DAX, if you thought actually stock markets are going to run out of steam, it is interesting up here because you've got an obvious place for a stop up above 16,000, those old highs from August. And let's see, I wouldn't go short personally, but I think it's an interesting one there that it hasn't, that it's lagged behind the US market. And the Nikkei, which had you know, something of a crazy couple of months, hadn't it? We had these moves in the Nikkei that in August, it moved to fresh lows for the year. And then a couple of weeks later, or 4 weeks later, it had moved to fresh highs for the year. Absolute crazy few weeks in the Nikkei. For me, not very interesting at the moment. Stuck in the middle a little bit, 28,800. But I'd still be a buyer on dips below 28,000. But just you can see, you know, that's the range for the year, and the market is stuck in the middle. So for me, there are more interesting markets to trade than the Nikkei at the moment. Let's take a look at Bitcoin. Let's look at the cryptocurrencies. Then we'll look at the other stuff. Do you know what I think is interesting, Bitcoin? That it hasn't powered higher, really, has it? Not yet, anyway. You know, this 60, what was the level? 64,000 or thereabouts was the old highs. I think we did we do a Bitcoin video this week on the channel? I think we did. Or maybe last week. Last week it was. And I thought what was maybe perhaps a bit telling here. I mean, I've got a couple of trades on Bitcoin, and there's trades in this account on Bitcoin, and I've got a stop loss in, I think, 58,000 on Bitcoin to take profits. What's interesting is it moved out last week through the previous all-time high, so it set fresh all-time highs last week, which is normally pretty bullish, but we haven't had any follow-through. It's given up those gains pretty quickly. And if we look, you know, back here in March and April, whenever Bitcoin would push up above 60,000, it didn't spend too long up there. So I just wonder, is there a feeling that above 60,000, Bitcoin is perhaps at a fair value for now, if it is possible to put a fair value on Bitcoin? I just thought it was quite, you know, the price action up here was quite interesting, that we moved out to those all-time highs and then gave it up pretty quickly. I mean, don't get me wrong, the trend for Bitcoin is still up. So if I had to do a trade now, I'd still be a buyer. And the closest I'd have my stop, at the very least, below yesterday's low. Let's flip it over to an hourly chart. So yesterday's low is about 58,000 or thereabouts. So for me, I'd argue that trend is still up. But I just think it is, you know, it's quite interesting that it hasn't really motored on since breaking out to those all-time highs. Maybe everyone who's bought Bitcoin has bought Bitcoin, and that's it. And the rest of us are just skeptics sat on the sidelines. I don't know, but I thought it was interesting that it didn't really get a move on. So another one to watch next week. Let's have a quick look at Ethereum while we're on the old cryptos. Because that hadn't hit fresh all-time highs, had it, from memory, when Bitcoin did. Oh, and it has, is it? It has today. Actually, well, there we go. It's another interesting one to watch. So it's just about today. What was the old all-time high? 43.70, and it's 43.97 today. Well, I think next week I would keep an eye on the cryptos, see what happens, see if Bitcoin goes out to fresh all-time highs, see if Ethereum gets a move on through here, through these all-time highs. But I do just wonder, is there, you know, I don't know, is there not the same sort of euphoria at the moment up at these levels for some of these cryptocurrencies, you know, that we were seeing back in April and May? Let's see what happens next month. But I thought it was an interesting one, that. Right, let's take a look at oil. I think it's a buying opportunity, oil. I think it's come off a bit the last couple of days, the oil price. It did trade as high as $85. This is West Texas. So traded up to near 85, which is, you know, again, the highest levels since October 2014, I think, isn't it? Something like that. Yeah, October 2014. For me, I still would say this trend is up. So this trend off the August lows, let's take a look at it on perhaps a 4-hour chart. Here we go. So where's the August lows? There's the August lows. So I think I'd be tempted to be a buyer. I haven't got any trades on oil at the moment, but for me, that trend is still up. So if I was a buyer today, maybe that's the trade we do. Let's get a trade done. So I'm going to buy it where it's trading now, 81.75 or something. And I'm going to put a stop loss, give it a bit of room, put a stop loss at 77. So I'm going to go the other side of that trend line and below those lows. So 77 is the stop. Let's do the trade. So $77. And we normally risk 100 quid on these trades. So if I buy 29 barrels with a stop loss at 77, my risk is £101. Let's go. Let's buy it. Done. Okay, so we bought crude oil. Because for me, you know, that trend is still up, even though it's come off for a couple of days. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Stop spamming with rubbish cryptocurrencies, please, in the chat. I will get around to them. So for me, that trend is still up. I think if oil starts to slip below $78, then perhaps this bit of the trend is over. I mean, it is quite incredible that it is up at these levels, given where it was in April of last year. But we are where we are, and for me, that trend for oil is still definitely up. Let's take a look at gold and silver. Gold and silver, the two most boring markets this year. I don't think anything's changed from that. Nope. So that's the price of gold going back to the beginning of the year. It's just sideways. It just struggles whenever it gets much above 1800, as we've seen over the last week. It just struggles. Just can't really hold on to any recoveries. I do have a trade running on gold at the moment, but it's really quite a longer term one. Just looking at that longer term trend from here, from August 2018. So we're 3 years into that. The trend is still up, but it's just been a really boring year for the price of gold. Much more interesting and more exciting markets. And I think it's the same for silver. So I think silver, up until recently, was even more boring than gold. So if we go back, there we go. That's the last 12 months, 15 months on silver. Just again, a pretty sideways year. I think I'm short silver at the moment. I've got a short on at the moment, looking for a run back to 21.65. Let's have a quick look. Where is it? Oh, there it is. So I'm short silver from 24.20 with a stop at 25.75. So it's up a little bit. It's just I find it a really quite a scrappy market. And for me, even though it's broken out that trend line, we've still got so far in silver lower highs and lower lows. So if I was a betting man, I would bet that the next $2 move is down from here back to 21 rather than up towards 26. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I think if silver does start trading through $25 up, it does look like perhaps this weakness since June is finally over. But for me at the moment, I'd probably still rather be short rather than long silver at the moment. But I think gold and silver are not the most exciting of markets and haven't been this year. Let's take a look at some of the currencies. I've actually got a trade on dollar yen at the moment, but let's kick things off with pound against the dollar. We did a trade last week. I remember now, one of the trades we did in the live stream last week. When would it have been? About here somewhere. We went short. Let's have a quick look. Is that still running? Pound against the dollar. Oh, there we go. Pound against the dollar short. 22nd October. So that was last week at 5 to 2 my time, or 5 to 2 GMT, with a stop at 139.50. So it's slightly in profit. I'd still be looking to go short the pound. I must admit, it's been a bit of a sideways week, pound against the dollar, but we've got real 138 to 139 has been a real ceiling for the price. So for me, I'd sort of be leaning towards it, taking a trip back down to 135. We've got the Bank of England interest rate decision next week, so we could see a bit of volatility for it ahead of that and over that. But overall, I think still a little bit weak. Again, I think if it needs to break through 139 to start shaking off this weakness. But another one, it's not been the most exciting market, not for me anyway, in recent months. Euro US dollar. Again, a bit of a look at. Look at this. Where is it now? 162, 116.26. Sorry, but it's pretty much where it was a week ago. Lots of volatility, no real move. And again, I'd say for me, that trend from May is still just about down. Euro US dollar. So just a bit nothing at the moment for me. Euro against the dollar. I suppose if you wanted to go short. Hang on a second. If you wanted to go short up here, putting a stop somewhere above 117, could be one option. But I think again, quite difficult markets to trade and sometimes a little bit scrappy up at these levels. So that's euro against dollar. And the trade I did yesterday is it was dollar yen. So the dollar against the yen. And I've seen a few questions about the dollar index as well. We'll take a look at that. So I bought dollar yen yesterday. It's been a good trade on dollar yen, a good trend on dollar yen, I should say. We have seen some US dollar strength this year, US dollar recovery. The dollar against the yen has really taken off over the last month or so. And it came back down, and it was holding yesterday above these old levels here. If I flip it over to an hourly, it might be a bit clearer. The reason, my reason for the trade, I ended up buying in about here yesterday, was just because, it sold off and it was holding around 113.40, had a bit of a false break, didn't go through, and it bounced back. So far that trade has worked out well. I had a pretty tight stop on that, so we'll see. We'll see how that one works out. But a bit of a scrappy week, I think, in the world of FX. We'll look at the dollar index. So DXY is the dollar index. And I think even if you don't follow currencies, the dollar index is always a really interesting market to watch, because it's the dollar against a mix of other currencies, against the Japanese yen, the euro, the pound, the Canadian dollar, etc. So it's expressing the dollar as an index. And I think it's always quite interesting to see which way sentiment is going for the US dollar. You can see in March of last year, up at March 2020, sorry, it traded up to 104. As we saw panic around the world because of the coronavirus. Everyone saw the dollar as a safe haven. Then, as everyone embraced risk again, the dollar really sold off. So it hit a low in January of this year, came back to the low in May, and we've seen the market bounce back. I'd be inclined to be a buyer of the dollar index here. I think we've had this good recovery from May. It got hit really hard yesterday, which I think can often be an opportunity. If the market, if we see maybe an overreaction to something, it can be an opportunity. So for me, if I was a buyer today, I'd put a stop loss probably the other side of 93. I think we did have, or maybe I've come out of it, there was a dollar index trade on here, but I think it's probably got closed out yesterday. So let's see. Natural gas, I forgot natural gas. Let's have a look at that. I think natural gas has been a great market this year, and I've got a trade on in my own account for natural gas, but I think it does feel as if the momentum has left this market now for natural gas. That trend is still up. It was a brilliant market to trade from April right to this blow off top in early October. I put a trade on about 5.5, I think, in the middle of October, and it's currently not doing much at all. I just wonder if some of that excitement and that craziness has gone out of the natural gas price now. Don't get me wrong, the trend for natural gas is still up, but it's perhaps, for me anyway, even though I'm in the trade, it's perhaps a better trade if it sells off and we see what happens if it pushes below 5 natural gas. Still a really interesting market to watch, considering what's going on with gas prices and energy prices around the world. But it does feel as if the craziness has left the natural gas market for now. So we'll see. So stuff to watch next week. I think Bitcoin and Ethereum are interesting, with Ethereum hitting all-time highs today. Bitcoin not really having the momentum that you might expect on that break to all-time highs last week. So I think that's an interesting market. Stock markets, clearly, because we had all-time highs again this week for the NASDAQ and the S&P, and the oil price. I did that trade on oil. I think oil has got hit the last couple of days, but perhaps we see something of a comeback for the price of oil next week. Let's see what happens, because for me that trend is still up. Right, what I'm going to do now is just jump into some of the questions here and have a look at some of the markets. Let's have a quick look. Lufthansa, someone's asked about. I think I had a quick look actually, just for something else we were doing, at some of the travel stocks this week. And I don't know if it's the case with Lufthansa, but a lot of these airlines, had a recovery and was struggling again. So let's take a look. Oh dear me, that's not pretty, is it? I mean it's Lufthansa is quite an extreme example, isn't it? So not surprisingly, if we go back. Actually, that's really quite interesting for Lufthansa. It's below the lows from March last year. I mean, it looks like it's an absolute dog of a chart, I think I'd be tempted to say here, because we had, clearly the pandemic lows for the stock market last year in March. There's Lufthansa. Then we saw, a recovery, of course, across markets. And then with the various lockdowns coming back in again, leisure stocks, travel stocks took a hit. And that's just taken a hit and a half, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what happened here for Lufthansa, 21st of September. I don't know if it had a profit warning or something, but it doesn't look too clever, does it, at the moment, Lufthansa? I mean, interestingly, it was pretty weak coming into all of this anyway. You know, we saw highs for Lufthansa in 2018. Then, of course, we had the pandemic in 2020. And it was going down anyway. It looks pretty weak to me. So for me, I would not be a buyer because the trend is down. And I'd be looking perhaps for opportunities to sell short. Maybe if I was going short now, probably the closest I'd have my stop would be above 6. I'm guessing that's €6. I'm guessing it's listed on a European exchange somewhere. But no, really weak, isn't it? So for me, definitely not a buy just yet at the moment. Let's see what else we've got. Apple. Some of these, I saw Amazon was down quite a bit today because did it miss on earnings or something last night? I think someone said buy the dip on Apple. I think that trend is probably still up on Apple, isn't it? But let's take a look. Let's take a look. Yeah. I mean, for me, clearly a great run. We had a bit of a wobble here around the trend line. But for me, I'd agree with whoever said buy the dip on Apple. I would still be looking for buying opportunities. You know, the trend is up. No market moves in a straight line forever. You know, a bit of volatility in the Apple price over the last couple of months. If I was a buyer now at 146, I'd have my stop loss the other side of these lows. These early October lows at 137 would be the closest I'd have it. So again, it feels as if over the last 6 weeks or so, some of the momentum has gone out of the Apple stock price. But you know, for me, that trend is still up for Apple. So I'd still be a buyer and dip. So I think if it did turn around and goes below 138, you know, perhaps we are seeing a shift in sentiment, and I'd start to be looking at the 120s from May of this year. But while it's above that 138 level, I'd still be inclined to be a buyer of dips. We looked at Tesla. What are your thoughts on DWAC? I've got absolutely no idea what that is. DWAC. Is that the company this week? Was it something to do with Trump this week? And it all went a bit nuts. I mean, we've only got, if that's the company, isn't it? We've only got a few days worth of data. I mean, you know, as I often say, when we look at, I mean, it's nuts for a start anyway, because it touched 120, didn't it? On the 25th of October. 27th of October, it more than halved. So, you know, if you've watched a few of these live streams, you know that I'm not a fan of crazy stocks like this, or lottery stocks, I think as I refer to them, that you buy them and then maybe next week they double or next week they halve. So for me, if I had to buy it, I'd buy it now and I put a stop loss the other side of 52, the lows from October. But it's not one for me. You know, it is crazy volatility. You know, anything that halves in a couple of days is nuts, isn't it? Really. So can you look at ETFs and different types of funds? Well, there are a lot of ETFs in the market. You know, we cover, I think, quite a few in here. I think is there a way of looking at ETFs on here? Oh, there you go. We've got a whole load of ETFs you can look at. Absolutely stacks of them. So it's difficult to know what to look at. But basically, if there's an ETF, if there's a market you want to track, like oil or gold miners or something like that, you can do it through ETFs. You know, for me, I'm a big fan of, what's the UK one? iShares S&P 500. I don't know if we cover it. The iShares S&P ETF. There we go. So I'm a fan of those because it's just a tracker. So I buy these in my sort of normal stockbroking account rather than trading account. So that's an ETF I'm familiar with. But basically, there's basically ETFs for everything, isn't there, really? Would you go short on Take-Two Interactive Software? Take-Two Interactive Software. I've heard those before, actually. Take-Two. I think we have looked at these before, haven't we? Take-Two Interactive. I mean, personally, that's a day. Let's have a look at the dailies. I don't know. It's a tricky one, isn't it? It's quite. I don't know. I think there are arguments for like buying or selling here, aren't there? Because you could take the view, the trend from Feb of this year had been down. but just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen it break out of this trend line. So you could take the view that actually the move over the last couple of weeks has been overdone. The market's overreacted to something and go short. If I was going short now, the closest I'd have my stop, I think there's a really obvious level for the stop, and it's just above those highs from May of this year. So if I was going short, that's where I would do that. You could also take the view that actually the weakness is over and the thing is reversing, in which case I'd be waiting to buy a dip personally. So I suppose if I had to do anything, I'd go short at the moment, but I feel a bit uncomfortable given the strength over the last couple of weeks. But it'd be interesting to see what happens up at 188 for take two, those old highs. So yeah, I know what I forgot to do, the contact details, didn't I? So of course I'm doing this with Capital.com today. So go to Capital.com to find out more about the platform, stuff like that. Open an account, open a demo account, download the app. Any questions after this, drop me an email. My email address is david.jones@capital.com. At Jones the Markets to follow me on Twitter, and follow Capital.com on YouTube, Twitter and Facebook. Right, let's just get back into the markets. We did Bitcoin. What's GILD? Let's have a look at GILD. GILD. Oh, it's the US stock, isn't it? Is it Gilead or Gilead? Biopharma. Okay. For me, I think I would probably be thinking about being a buyer, maybe. But I mean, we'd had this recovery for most of this year, hadn't we? And it's gone from what, $56 to 72 and a half, and it's been knocked back. I think that's one for me. I'd keep an eye on it next week because we had a lot of support ahead of 61. So for me, if it was under pressure next week and we saw a bit of strength coming in at 61, it starts to look like an interesting stock, I think, down there. So it wouldn't be one that I'd necessarily jump on today, but I think it's an interesting one to watch, given that there is so much support down at 61 and a half. So let's see what happens. Wells Fargo, the US bank. We did this, I should say, of course, we do have a stocks channel, a stocks YouTube channel, where we look at individual stocks. The link for that channel is in the bottom of this video. So if you haven't subscribed to that, take a look at that. And we did do Wells Fargo within the last couple of weeks. I mean, for me, that trend is most definitely up, isn't it? It's not all-time highs where it is now, but it's back to where it was in January 2020. So for me, I'd be a buyer. The only question is, would you buy here? Because we're just about having a look through the all-time high. So I think there's a couple of things here. I think first of all, I'd rather buy a dip. So I'd sit here and wait to see, do we get a dip? But if the thing did move through $52, I'd be tempted to jump on it and see if we're going to get a real breakout. So for me, the stock is clearly strong. It's had a good trend this year, and I'd be a buyer. The only question is, do I wait or do I jump in on the breakout? So let's see what happens. Total Energies. Is it Total Fina or Total? What's that one? French Energy. I'm guessing it might be that one. Oh, I don't know though. What do we think? I mean, it should have been a good year for lots of energy stocks. What does this one do? Oil and gas, natural gas, and low carbon energies. I mean, it is up for the year. Where did it come into the year? It came into the year around 35. It's trading at 43. So it's up 20% on the year. It's been a good return. Again, for me, if I had to do anything, I'd be a buyer. Because it's broken out through 42. Hang on a second, which looks something like that. That was the old highs. So for me, if I was a buyer now at 43, the closest I put my stop is 40 to see if this breakout is going to carry on from here. So it's it's an interesting one. The fact that it has traded back to its best levels since February of 2020. So let's see what happens. We looked at crude oil. Facebook, of course, did they're changing their name, aren't they, to Meta. Facebook. Let's have a look at Facebook. I'd be a buyer, I think, of Facebook. I think this is the longer term trend, isn't it? Let's take a look at it. Yeah. There we go. So for me, I would be inclined, even though it's fallen out through the bottom of the trend, I'd be inclined to give it one last chance. Maybe we'll do this. Maybe this is another trade we'll do. And I suppose for those of you who are fans of oscillators, we do have what's known as bullish divergence going on here. The market slipped to a low, slipped lower still. The RSI is making higher lows. So it's a suggestion that perhaps the weakness we're seeing is running out of steam. So let's do a trade on Facebook. Let's give it one last chance to get back into the trend. So these old lows from back here are around 294. So let's say I'm going to be a buyer. 290 is quite a wide stop, I suppose, but it only needs to get up to here to break even. So let's do that. So we'll put a stop in at 290 on Facebook, which means if we buy 4 shares at 323, stop at 290, my risk is £96. So let's buy that. There we go, done. Bought 4 at 323 and a bit. So for me, I just want to see if these old lows from April this year hold, if it's perhaps been knocked back a bit too far. So my target would be for a run back up to 380 from here, back up to those highs. If that trend is going to resume, look to see if we can run back up to the highs. Let's see how it works out. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're okay for time. Wells Fargo, it's that. Coinbase. I've looked at Coinbase for a while. So Coinbase, of course, floated this year, the old crypto exchange. Now, I guess it was doing well because crypto's done well. So it's done okay, hasn't it? It's still well off those highs. If you bought Coinbase on the first day of trading, it touched 428 during the day and then slid back to 205 not too long after. So for me, again, I'm not really a fan of some of these. I don't know. We haven't got that much data, have we? But I'd probably have to be a buyer. We'd have to be a buyer rather than a seller. The time to buy was more back here, obviously, with a stop underneath those lows. If I was a buyer now, where would you put your stop if I was a buyer now? I don't know. Maybe in the middle of the range at 260. I think it's always a tricky one when it moves out like this. I'd rather see if we get a deeper sell-off and buy the dip, but it does look like it's turned the corner a bit, doesn't it? During October, after having this sort of fairly wide sideways range, we're actually picking up a bit of momentum. No, so there you go. Virgin Galactic. Virgin Galactic is a strange one, isn't it? Where it has it's Richard Branson's space vehicle thingy, isn't it? For taking people into space. And it does have these absolutely explosive moves when there's some news, and then when there's no news, it goes nowhere. So for me, this was back in June, July. This was the test flight that he did, and it spiked. I think the very next day was here because he did it over the weekend, and I think it had a good start the next day, but then it sold off. It's a very news-driven stock, but I suppose if we were looking at it, from a support and resistance point of view. If you want to be a buyer anyway, we're getting close to what have been, 12-month lows on Virgin Galactic. You mentioned the weekly trend line. I suppose what you're picking up on, we're picking up on these lows from back here. So for me, it's maybe pushing it a bit to have a trend. Well, it is. I suppose we do have higher highs and higher lows, don't we? I shouldn't go bending the rules. So I suppose it is interesting down here. If I was a buyer now at $19, I would want a stop loss. The closest would be, it's going to be a long way away, but it's the other side of the May lows. It's down below 14 somewhere. So it's a 5, 6, maybe even more dollar stop loss. But given how volatile it is, you need to give these things time to move around, don't you? So let's see. Natural gas, we looked at natural gas. Don't forget, next week there's only 4 hours between the UK and New York. Okay, so the UK goes back, but the US goes back an hour later. Thanks for that. I always miss that. One Life Healthcare. One Life Healthcare. I must admit, I've never heard of them, but let's have a look. There we go. One Life Healthcare. What's their story? Healthcare technology and management services company. Blah 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 blah. Okay. I have to say the trend doesn't look too encouraging on that one, does it? we've just been sort of zigzagging our way lower for much of this year, going from 60 down to 22 at the moment. So for me, I'd still be looking to sell short, if anything. You know, it's a weird mover, isn't it? It sort of falls off a cliff, goes a bit sideways, then falls off a cliff again. We're currently in the going a bit sideways mode, boom, and maybe it's going to fall off a cliff again. I don't know. So for me, again, it's probably not one for me, for my style of trading, to be honest, but I'd be worried that trend was still down. If I absolutely had to be a buyer now, I'd put my stop loss the other side of the September lows at $19 for me, but I don't. Famous last words, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere in a hurry anytime soon, but let's see. What do you think about Euro Aussie dollar? Euro Aussie, hold on a sec. I just lost where I was. Euro Aussie. I think we've looked at this one before and it was interesting, wasn't it? Let's have a quick look. Euro Aussie dollar. There we go. It's certainly more interesting than Euro against the US dollar. I would say, first of all, I think you'd have to say, is this a daily? This is a daily chart. You'd have to say, or I'd have to say, that trend from October is still down. The trend it's been a great trend actually. If you got in on that, it's just always gone down every day. So it's moved about 700 points lower since the end of September. But I suppose it's down here, if you really wanted to do a little bit of bottom fishing, I think it's quite interesting down here. So for me, I might even add it to things to watch next week, because, you know, it made such a base down here, the euro against the Aussie dollar, from February to May. Are we going to see the same thing again? So I would probably be a bit nervous about selling short down here, because it's come so far and we're back to what if I could talk, what had been a major level for the stock, major support for the stock. So let's see what happens down at these levels. See if we can get a bit of a bounce coming in. Gas, we looked at gas. Amazon, yeah, I think Amazon were a bit. I think Amazon is just still boring, isn't it? It's just still stuck in that sideways range a little bit. Yeah, it's just exactly you know, stuck in a range. Amazon, even though it's got knocked a bit today, it's trading pretty much where it was this time last year. You know, it's just a bit boring, isn't it? Twitter. Yes, have a look at Twitter. I haven't looked at Twitter for a while. Twitter. Did they miss on earnings? I guess they did, didn't they? I think I remember a headline from this week. That would explain the big sell-off. I must admit, I'd be tempted to be a buyer. Not a buyer today, but on the basis that maybe the reaction is being overdone, perhaps. But I'd be one to watch next week. Perhaps let's come back to it next Friday, because we've got good support down just below $50, $48.50 for this one. So let's see what happens. I'd be looking to be a buyer on Twitter, just not today, I think. What else have we got? Alibaba. There had been a downtrend, hadn't it? There'd been a massive, I think, does it look like it's starting to turn the corner a bit? Let's have a look. No, is the quick answer. There we go. There's that. We've looked at this before, haven't we? Great shorting opportunity about a week ago at $180. Nice downtrend, and the trend is still down, isn't it? So for me, it's interesting that it almost stopped. I mean, it had a little look through these September highs, didn't it? But it didn't last long, and it's come off again. That's almost a textbook downtrend in Alibaba. So let's see what happens. But for me, it needs to take out that old high just from the other week to suggest that perhaps the weakness is changing. So let's see what happens. Facebook, we looked at Facebook. Sugar has been, I looked at some of the stats for me, my own trading. It has been the most profitable market for me over the last 12 months. US sugar futures, I think let's have a look at the cash market, because it's been a great trend, and I'm long at the moment sugar. But it has been, if you go back to, how far should we go back? So a nice little trend on sugar, and again over the last 3 months, broke out. This is UK sugar, so broke out to new highs since 2017 this week. UK sugar. So for me, I'd still be a buyer. I wouldn't buy today though. I might buy. See if we see a bit of strength coming in next week. We don't seem to have. It looks like we've stopped covering sugar US, and now we've got the futures rather than the cash by the looks of it. Yeah. But I'm guessing it's going to be a similar sort of values. But for me, you know, some of these commodities, it's been an absolutely nuts year for some commodities and a great trend in sugar. So for me, I'd be a buyer, but I'd wait for a bit of strength to come in for sugar and see what happens. What do you think about dollar Canada? I've got a trade on dollar Canada at the moment, and it is underwater dollar Canada. It did well in the beginning, but it hasn't done well recently. But let's have a look at it. So I bought dollar against the Canadian dollar. I think it was about here in August or maybe in September, whenever it was, because this trend that had been in place, I thought it had changed. You know, the trend had changed, had a bit of a run up, and it's just gone plop again. So for me, I've got the trade on at the moment and I'm losing money at the moment. I've got a stop loss in place. If I had to do a trade now, I would be a buyer, and I'd use that old low, which I think you might have mentioned, as the low. So I think it's interesting, that one for next week. If we see a bit of a US dollar comeback, do we get a lift in the likes of dollar Canadian dollar? And that low is 122.50. So I think if it started trading much below 122.50, perhaps we're going to go back to those lows from May. So yeah, it needs to get a bit of a move on from here. So let's see what happens. So a chance to buy, yeah, I would agree with you on that. But who knows? No one's got a crystal ball, do they? Can we look at Garmin? Garmin, is that the sat-nav company? Garmin. Garmin. What do they do now? They must do more specialist sat-navs, mustn't they? Marine, maybe. Rather than, because I don't think anybody's buying sat-navs to plug onto their car windscreens anymore, are they? It's interesting that it's done. I mean, clearly it's doing well in other areas of the business. I mean, it had an absolutely fantastic run. Look at that. So 2020 lows for Garmin was $62, and it almost, tripled into August of this year. It's got really hit, hasn't it? Interesting. What do you think? Let's have a look. Let's pick up on the trend. Let's have a look at the trend on it. I would be tempted to give it one last chance, even though I think I might mention this, when I look at trend lines and they break trend lines, I'm often tempted just to give it one more chance to try and get back in the trend. I mean, it's been pretty weak. You know, this week's got really hammered this week, isn't it? But I think it'd be an interesting one to watch next week to see if the old lows hold. 134, 135, something like that. Watch to see. That for me, if it's sort of a bit of strength next week, that looks an interesting buy. I think that one. So let's see. Let's see what happens. ARK, which is the Cathy Wood investment ETF. Someone asked about ETFs before, didn't they? So the big holding in Tesla, of course. ARK. It's been a bit of an underperformer, hasn't it, really? And had a great year last year. There we go. But quite the underperformer over recent months, particularly when you consider the NASDAQ 100 is at fresh all-time highs just about yesterday. And ARK has been a little bit sideways. I mean, I do watch this one as a potential sort of longer-term purchase, and it just looks a bit boring at the moment, ARK. I mean, you know, fantastic last year, went from $35 to $160 in Feb, and hasn't really, you know, considering that Tesla's doing really well, the NASDAQ's doing well, hasn't really kept pace with it, is it? So a bit boring, I think, ARK. What do you think about Lemonade? Is there actually a market called Lemonade? I'm guessing it's not actually. Oh, it is Lemonade. Well, there you go. What is it? Various insurance products to customers in the United States and Europe. Wow, you learn something new every day. I mean, for me, if I was going to buy it anywhere, then this looks like an interesting area to buy, doesn't it? Because it's back down to the lows from May. So the lows from May were about $60, and it's traded down to 60. So I've never heard of them before. If I had to buy them, if I had to do anything, I'd be tempted to be perhaps a buyer with stops the other side of $60. But who knew? I thought it was going to be a cryptocurrency then, lemonade. We looked at dollar Canada, looked at Amazon. Baidu. What's Baidu? Is that I don't know who they are. I'm not going to guess. I've heard the name. Baidu is it's the search engine, of course, the Chinese search engine business, isn't it? What do you think? I mean, a lot of Chinese stocks, Chinese tech stocks, clearly have been hit in recent months anyway because of the clampdown by the Chinese government, by the state. I think when they're like this, it can be a bit confusing because you think because I'd wonder, is it looking like it's that downtrend wherever we take it from, is finally over. So I would probably lean to be a buyer again, not today because it's been quite weak today, but I think that's another, to use the word, interesting one for next week, just to see if the whole 135 to 145 area holds next week, to see what happens. So it's definitely one to watch, and perhaps not as weak as it used to be. I'm just seeing how the little trades we did today are doing. So we're losing 13 quid on crude oil, and we're making £2 on Facebook so far. Let's see what happens. That was the trade from last week. The pound is up 35, and American Water, I think, was a stock I remember from last week that's up a fiver. Let's see what happens. We looked at the NASDAQ. NASDAQ was one of the first ones we looked at. Corn. Have we got corn? Do we cover corn? Let's have a look. We don't cover it yet by the looks of it, so we can't look at that. But a lot of these commodities have done really well. IYR. What's IYR? Let's have a look. We don't cover that one yet either. This market is not available yet. So we said last time to look at Zoom, Halliburton and Palantir. Let's have a look then. Zoom. Which Zoom is it? Zoom Video, isn't it? That's the one. So of course did really well during the old pandemic. Looks pretty weak there, doesn't it? Had a good run from May, from 270 up to 400, but it slipped right back. So Zoom this month has traded to its lowest level since August of last year. So a tricky one. I suppose if you were going to buy it, I'd put a stop the other side of those lows at 245. But it still looks a bit weak, doesn't it? Halliburton. Let's have a look at Halliburton. Halliburton. There we go. This to me is more interesting than Zoom because of the fact it's broken out to the highest it's been since, where have you got to go back to in Halliburton? Best levels since 2019. So a 2.5 year high in Halliburton this month. So for me, I'd be a buyer because it's a breakout. The only question is, where would your stop go, or where would my stop go? The absolute closest I put the stop, the other side of 23.80. Probably a bit lower though. So for me, I'd be expecting a bit more strength medium term in that one on the basis of the breakout. But let's see. And then Palantir. I always get confused with what this one is. I remember the first time we looked at it, I thought it was a marijuana stock, and it's clearly not. It's big data, isn't it? Yeah, there we go. Big data analytics. That's what they are. And it's got, I remember it got absolutely clobbered, I think, this year, didn't it? It had a great run up. So where did it go? In January. Was it one of the meme stocks in January? Was it caught up in that whole GameStop thing? Wall Street Bets. So traded up to 45, then dumped 17.5. It looks a bit boring, I think. I'd rather be a buyer on dips than a seller. But it just looks, it's just not going anywhere, is it? There's no trend. And for me, I want to have a trend. I don't want to try and second guess something and sit with it while it goes nowhere really. So for me, it's not an interesting one. It's just a little bit boring. Will there be a sell-off on Avis at earnings? Let's have a look. I wonder what happened to Hertz stock this week with that Tesla, 100,000 Tesla. Oh, that's a great chart, isn't it? Look at that. So Avis, blah, 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 car rentals and all that stuff. I mean, wow, that's done incredibly well. Who would have thought it? So since 2020, $10, and then $170 today. Amazing. Why have they done that? That seems ridiculous, doesn't it, for a car rental company to have gone up 17-fold since March 2020. I mean, for me, you say earnings are coming out, which is fair enough. So you could see, I suppose, you could see some volatility over earnings. I mean, the trend is up. The only problem I have, as I often say, when you see these ones that have gone up like a rocket, is where would your stop go? I could maybe put an order in to buy if it breaks 180 and put a stop, I don't know, 150. Tricky one though, but a great performer. Avis, maybe the better trade, like you say, is to wait and see what happens when the earnings come out. But that's done incredibly well. I'm curious now. What does Hertz look like then? Is Hertz then? No. Am I spelling it wrong? I don't think so. No. Okay. Shiba. Is this crazy cryptocurrency that's named after Elon Musk's dog? Isn't it? Isn't that the story here? Again, I mean, if you're in it and you've made money, then it's brilliant. It's absolutely crazy though. You know, where's it gone? It's gone from 0.00001 to 0.00072. So it's gone up sevenfold since the beginning of October. As I often say for these, I should have a little video clip that I play when we look at these. If you're in it and you make money, it's great. I just think it's incredibly hard to apply any sort of sensible trading logic to something that goes up sevenfold in 2 weeks. If I was a buyer now, I would put my stop loss at 0.00005 is where my stop would go. But you know, we know with some of these non-mainstream coins, altcoins, whatever they're called, that the volatility can be crazy. You know, but if you've been in it, you've made money. Well done. But for me, it's not one I'd trade because it's just too crazy, isn't it? Too crazy. Garmin, aviation and marine count for 50% of their business, but income down by 11%. Thanks for that, Richard. That's that Garmin, the old sat-nav chart. Shiba coin, we looked at Shiba coin. There's no need for that sort of language, is there? There we go, let's just get rid of that. Shiba is a joke on Dogecoin, so it's a joke on a joke. Let's have a look at Dogecoin. Maybe you know, November is going to be Doge month. What do you reckon? What's Dogecoin done? I suppose, did that get dragged up by Shiba coin? Not so much. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? It's gone. So Doge went from 0.7 down to 0.15 in July. So from May to July. I mean, these are lottery ticket things, aren't they? I think, you know, there's no, as someone said, he knows more about it than I do. It's a joke on a joke, isn't it? So no, it's a bit crazy. But again, if you make money, making money is the name of the game. Someone said Ocugen, buy a pharma stock. Let's have a look at Ocugen. Ocugen. There we go, Ocugen Ink. What's the story? What's their story? Clinical stage biopharma company focused on discovery, blah, 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 to cure blindness diseases. Okay, let's have a look at their stock. They look a bit thinly traded and a little bit boring to me, is what I'd have to say. And they listed in is it US? Okay, US stock. It's just a bit scrappy, isn't it? So again, for me, you know, no real trend. $11 stock at the moment. If I was a buyer now, I mean, a lot of volatility. Again, you know, it's gone from below 7 to 13 just in October. You know, a lot of volatility in the stock. But again, for me, from a sensible trading point of view, where would you put your stop? I'd have to put it down at $7, which is a long way away. So a little bit sideways and not the sort of stock for me because there's no real trend. We looked at Tesla, actually, was the first thing we looked at was Tesla. Someone's put Tesla in. So if you watch the recording. And the last one we look at is PayPal. Because it's interesting, this story, isn't it? Because they put the bid in for Pinterest. And I think it's not happening, wasn't it? Is that the story this week? The PayPal bid for Pinterest isn't happening. I would be tempted to watch PayPal and looking to be a buyer in PayPal. Maybe should we do it? Let's do it. We did it. We did Facebook already this week, didn't we? I'd be watching PayPal next week because 220 has been such a floor underneath the PayPal stock. It's the lows for the year. It's heading towards those lows now. I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch next week to see what happens with PayPal. And I'd be watching for the bounce next week in PayPal. But if it goes below 220, bang, I'd completely change my mind. But I think it's interesting to watch for a bounce down at these levels. So a bit of disappointment, perhaps because of them not going ahead with the bid for Pinterest. Right, we'll wrap things up there. So we'll do it all again next week. It's non-farm payrolls next Friday. So pretty volatile. About an hour. It's not an hour before we start, is it? Because of the time difference that you said, the time changes. So I've got no idea when the payrolls will be coming out next week because our clocks go back and the US clocks don't. So actually, we'll be starting, is that right? We'll be starting next week's session when the payrolls come out, or 2 hours after the payrolls come out, one way or the other. We'll see when we're there. Thanks for coming along. Go to Capital.com to open an account, play around with the demo account, all that sort of stuff. Any questions, drop me an email, david.jones@capital.com. Follow me on Twitter, @JonesTheMarkets, and of course follow Capital.com on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. We'll do it all again next week. Loads going on as usual. But that's it for now. Have a good weekend and good luck with your trading.